Hello, everyone. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Alex Ghenis to the show. Alex is the Deputy Director of Sustain Our Abilities, which is a nonprofit all about helping people with disabilities as we approach an era of significant climate change. How is climate change affecting people with disabilities? Welcome to the show, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Happy to be here. Happy to be here.
Today, today I'm interested in speaking with you, Alex, because this show is specifically interested in the issue of accessible housing. And from our discussions, I understand that climate change is actually rather significantly going to impact the housing choices of people with disabilities. And that's what we want to talk about today. So before we get into that, can you tell me a little bit about Sustain Our Abilities and what kind of the work it's doing?
Yeah, Sustain Our Abilities is a nonprofit focused on the intersection of climate change and disability. It's a really kind of multifaceted uh, effort that we're doing. We're working on issues certainly around research and shaping that into policy to help people with disabilities during climate change. And there's kind of two pillars to this. There's number one is mitigation, which is reducing carbon emissions and trying to limit the amount of climate change. And then there's adaptation, which is recognizing that a certain amount of climate change is already happening and there's going to be more on the way, and we need to start getting ready for that. So we look at how to best make both of those inclusive and accessible.
So let's start by you telling us a little bit about your organization, Sustain Our Abilities.
Yeah, absolutely. So Sustain Our Abilities is a nonprofit that's about 3 years old. And we are actually going through right now kind of a internal evaluation and refocusing our efforts. So we look at the impacts of climate change on people with disabilities, which touches a whole bunch of things because climate change is really multifaceted and disability is really multifaceted. So we do research and we try to shape policy and provide policy recommendations around that. We do education for professionals, policymakers, and the general public. And we're also helping to coordinate advocacy, such as through the existing Day for Tomorrow events that we've had over the past 3 years. And I'll just say that the two pillars of climate change that we really care about are number one, mitigation, which is trying to limit climate change as much as possible, and number two, adaptation, which is getting ready for climate change. And actually, housing fits into both of those pillars, and accessible housing, absolutely, because of that, is a topic we're interested in.
So before we get into the specifics about accessible housing, there may be some of my listeners who might question, why is there a relationship between disability and accessibility and rights of people with disabilities and the human dignity of people with disabilities and climate change in general? Like, why is there a need for an intersection at all? Because change is affecting all humans. So what is it that makes this important, that we look at climate change through the lens of the quote unquote disability community in any aspect?
Yeah. If you can imagine, I recently put together a PowerPoint presentation, and there's a slide on this, which is if you can imagine on one half of the slide, you've got a column with the impacts of climate change. So you have things like increasing natural disasters, everything from storms, floods, hurricanes, those are all storms, forest fires, extreme heat, which is something that we're increasing our focus on. Then there's economic knock-on effects. There's actually issues around mass migration. On the mitigation front, there is reducing our emissions around transportation, actually around housing, because there's certain efficiencies and other carbon footprints of having housing, and that matters about where housing is. So, and then on the other column is all the factors of disability, different categories of disability, which would be, mobility, and then sensory, and then intellectual and developmental disability. You can get into the specifics. I personally have a spinal cord injury, and extreme heat is a big issue for us because of thermoregulation. You can get into jobs and employment, because we care about people with disabilities being employed in the green economy. And you have these two columns, and what you can do is you can draw a line between any of the climate impacts and any of the disability factors. So that's why it's so complex, and that's why each of those strings can be a point of advocacy, it can be a point of research, and it touches so much of society.
Do you think people with disabilities, to use a very broad catchphrase, right? Do you
Mhm.
think people with disabilities are there's more potential for them to be negatively impacted by the effects of climate change as opposed to the broader overall population?
Oh, absolutely. You have the physiological impacts, which would be someone with COPD, right? And if there's forest fires or more smog ending up in there where they live, then that's going to exacerbate any sort of respiratory related disability. Me, with my spinal cord injury and other people with mobility disabilities, we care about what storm evacuations look like. We care about certainly evacuations from fires and other things where you really, really need that. If you're in tornado country, then what's a shelter look like? These are things that we absolutely care about. And then on the other side is the green transition has a slight risk of kind of leaving us behind, or raising dangers that would especially be dangerous for us.
What do you mean by leaving us behind? Can you give me an example of why there's that risk?
Yeah, well, we're seeing it right now, for example, in the availability of all electric vehicles. There are no all electric wheelchair accessible vans that you would get
I
from
had no idea.
Bronaville.
Really?
Yeah, they just this
Wow.
year came out with the first hybrid, even.
Wow.
So, what's that look like? What does micromobility look like for our community? If you have a very transit-heavy infrastructure, then how do you make sure, you and I here are both in the Bay Area, and we have BART, which is kind of our heavy rail, like long-distance subway thing, and people with disabilities always raise the headaches of, are those elevators working or not for us to get to the
Right.
station, right?
Right.
So you have to build kind of these resilient piece of infrastructure. And another part that certainly I care about, and we're seeing a lot here in California, is the issue of, if you install a lot of renewable energy, that we call them intermittent renewables. They're reliant on the strength of the wind one day or what time of day it is for the sun, and the demand curve of when people need electricity ends up not aligning with that. You get a rolling blackout, right? You get power issues. And what's that mean for somebody who has a disability that impacts their ability to breathe, and then they use a ventilator? If the power goes out and it goes out for longer than a battery on their ventilator is, then that endangers their life and well-being. So again, this is multifaceted. I could get into the
Oh, it's
details
great.
of it,
No,
but you can
this is
see the
great.
connections here.
Absolutely. It seems kind of scary, actually, as we explore, as we deal with the claim changing climate and all the factors coming out from that, how unprepared policymakers seem to be around the concerns of quote unquote the disability community. So I just wanted to be really clear about that. And so what I want to talk about for most of our time together, though, is specifically about housing. And so let's get into that part of it. How is climate change impacting housing and housing development, and why is that a challenge around provision of housing for people with disabilities?
Yeah, and it's a two-way street. You have how does urban development shape where people live and what types of housing they live in. Again, the Bay Area is kind of a place in California where I've worked a lot. And in terms of wildfires, What we have is because there's heavy job demand in the Bay Area, but we haven't built our cities vertically enough, and we still have a bunch of single family zoning in places like Berkeley, many parts of Oakland, many parts of San Francisco. We get this urban sprawl, and more housing is pressing up against the forests that are getting drier because of the extended drought that's exacerbated by climate change. And then we have events like we saw certainly in Santa Rosa, of a couple of big firestorms that took out a ton of homes there. And then the people that are even farther out in the exurbs and rural areas where their homes are literally surrounded by trees. They're not backed up against the forest, they are in the forest. So there's dangers to what that means for the housing stock, the stability of the housing stock, the long-term investment, and whether those homeowners will be displaced and what other housing markets they'll put pressures on as they're trying to find new homes. So that's an issue that we care about. And in terms of disability, you have this dynamic where the people with fewer resources tend to be pushed farther away from the city center because that's where the more affordable housing is. So here we've got a dynamic where there's more and more people in danger of fires, and people with disabilities are disproportionately in the counties and cities that are in fire risk areas. And then on the flip side, when a fire hits, those areas have more sprawl. People with disabilities can't evacuate as quickly. So where the housing is really increases the law of dangers, you could point to other parts of the country, certainly low-lying areas in places like Florida, and what that's going to mean long-term for the housing stock. We saw the condo collapse, and that was partially due to some seawater kind of undermining and influencing the groundwater tables and the limestone there that they have over in Florida. And there's a danger of building homes that aren't going to be in a stable location in the coming decades. So that's one part of it. And the other part is building housing can be a great part of climate mitigation. Uh, we,
Building it.
yeah, building it in the right places can
Ah,
be a great part of climate mitigation. Here in, here and then in many other areas, we have a growing focus on transit-oriented development.
right.
Uh, and getting rid
So this
of
is, sorry,
sorry.
just to clarify for listeners who might not be aware of this idea, this
Mhm.
is where you're building housing stock around a subway station or a major transportation hub within a city. Is that correct way to think about transit-oriented development?
Yeah, and you could
Yeah.
have it right on top of, again, an example here would be a BART station here in the Bay Area, or there's going to be low-income housing going up over by Eastmont Mall, which
In Oakland.
in Oakland, which has a hub of a good dozen different bus lines, as well as is located right next to a bunch of social services. Talk about a great opportunity for people with disabilities that use the bus and need quick access to a social worker. Transit-oriented development is a great opportunity to reduce carbon emissions because people can simply hop down the stairs or the elevator to the train station to then get to work, and they don't have to drive. Other housing designs, such as reducing parking minimums in apartment complexes, first of all, can reduce people's desire to own a car and then drive and have those carbon emissions there. And something that we care from the disability rights and justice community, those are cheaper to rent because they're cheaper to build because you don't need a big concrete podium for a bunch of cars to park in. So actually the rents on these low or zero parking ones are more affordable. Uh, you have all that. That's a big part of reducing emissions, as well as I'd say increasing the ability to build duplexes and having those go near transit and just having more density in general. And from the disability rights perspective, that housing needs to be accessible. before I came on the show, I binged a bunch of your podcasts, and you had one guest from the Pacific ADA Center that was talking about the minimum requirements for housing accessibility, and how a tenant may need to pay for a bathroom remodel or conversion or something like that. We need to go beyond and support kind of the legislation that was mentioned in that episode, moving through DC and moving through state houses to make sure that these new transit-oriented developments can be accessible for people with disabilities.
Right, right, exactly. I think that people it's also overwhelming. People struggle to make the connection with how a warming climate impacts their lives beyond it being just a super hot day where we're pounding the air conditioner, right? And how this is impactful for housing and the stability of housing in certain types of locations. One of the some of the guests I've had on the show recently have been really into this whole idea of inclusive housing, includes the whole idea of inclusive neighborhoods, inclusive communities. Do you think that's environmentally friendly?
I mean, absolutely. The podcast that you had guests that spoke about that. I mean, I can only imagine what's the saved carbon footprint when you have a apartment complex or kind of a denser, bunch of say townhomes for people with disabilities that are able to use stairs and live in those townhomes. If you have that whole community and a community of people who use care attendants and just have 1 or 2 hour shifts because of the services that they get from a government, my goodness, if an attendant can go to kind of this intentional, really vibrant disability community and hop from one apartment, do a 1 hour shift, hop to the next apartment, do a 2 hour shift, how many carbon emissions is that saving driving from client to client halfway across town or in a different city? And then add on that the people with disabilities who live there, especially if you have a transit-oriented community, will get all the benefits of transit-oriented development and saving carbon emissions that way.
Do you think it's important? Actually, before I get to that, what about technology? How is some of the emerging smart home technology and other sophisticated uses of technology that I've talked about on this show with guests, um, both like how is that helping or not helping the fight to mitigate, and also the other thing you said for climate change, the two ways we're dealing with it, is technology that we use to create safer and more secure housing impactful either positively or negatively on the fight to manage our climate situation?
Um, I, I I'm not sure how much, but just kind of brainstorming here. I would say that it certainly can, it when it's well designed,
Hmm.
and in otherwise accessible, inclusive housing, um,
Hmm.
it can make those homes more desirable to live in
Yes.
for someone with a
Yeah.
disability. For people without disabilities, I mean, shoot, you've got a smart lock on your front door. Someone
Yeah.
with a disability could give a code to their care attendant.
Yeah.
Someone without a disability could give a code to their best friend that they trust, and that they
Right.
know is going to arrive earlier than them. So you do that, you add it in the right homes. You add them in apartment buildings where the developer can purchase these things at lower cost, and more power to them for doing so, and install smart locks on all of the apartments. And again, I'll say transit-oriented development a million times during this conversation. That makes it appealing. That makes people with disabilities feel more comfortable. Maybe if they have concerns about living in an urban area and safety, knowing that once they leave their home, if they say, "Oh my God, I forgot to lock my apartment," just being able to pull out the phone and log on and lock their apartment remotely will probably make them feel more comfortable. Another thing is good HVAC systems are
Hmm.
going to be really, really important in an age of climate change. We need, especially here on the West Coast, we need more air conditioning. And that's a double-edged sword because the wrongly designed air conditioning systems can release climate greenhouse gases that are actually pretty dangerous, called hydrofluorocarbons. Um,
Mhm.
but otherwise, we need air conditioning. What you saw in the heat wave in the Pacific Northwest recently is that that was last year, that killed several hundred people. And actually, I believe a good amount of people in nursing homes too, which matters to the disability community. Um,
Absolutely.
it's largely because they didn't have the same level of air conditioning that you'd have in the South, where it's
Right.
frequently hot and muggy. People simply weren't prepared, and the infrastructure wasn't ready for it. It's the same thing that we're seeing right now in London, even, because that's an old housing stock that is not designed for extreme heat.
Right.
I'll just say a smart home being able to set temperature for people that with disabilities that transfer into bed and can't transfer themselves out, and it's an incredibly hot night and they forgot to set the air conditioning, but their attendant is already gone.
Ah,
Just
yeah.
bust out your cell phone from your bed, adjust the thermostat that way, or adjust it before you go home, and you can save a little bit of energy, because you're out of the house, you let the home get warm, and then you're coming back in and you set it with an hour ahead of time so that it's comfortable.
One of the things that you mentioned to me was that when people with disabilities are looking for housing, this the impact of climate change and the impending climate change issues should be top of mind, should be something they're thinking about when they're looking for housing, which kind of made me feel, oh my God, they're already worried about finding something accessible. They're already worried about trying to find something affordable. They're already worried about trying to find something where they have care services in a reasonable proximity. We're adding yet another overlay of things they should be thinking about when they're buying or when they're renting or trying to find housing. How important do you think it is compared to those other things? Or are they all equally important?
Well, I'll say from a personal standpoint, I recently moved out of Berkeley, partially because of the housing costs that
Right.
you just mentioned. That town, the rents were just going up astronomically, and tried to figure out where I wanted to live, and I ended up hopping one town over to Oakland, where they've done a whole bunch of construction, and it's helped to kind of mellow out the rent increases in Oakland. And I did that because we have much more stable, cooler temperatures than even going 5 or 10 miles west over a couple of hills and through a
Yeah,
tunnel.
that's true.
Um, we'll have 70 something degree days, and then Brentwood, 20 miles away, will be in the high 90s.
Yeah, that's right.
Me with my spinal cord injury, I said, oh, I want to live here, and if I'm going to live in Oakland, I don't want to be in an area higher up in the hills where we had the wildfire in 1991, and it's still vulnerable to having wildfires. I chose, flatlands. These are things that I think people with disabilities need to think about in terms of their health and safety. Health, number one, because of things like extreme heat, wildfire smoke. Certainly, we get it here, and that's an issue for breathing. Uh, you know, uh, uh, when you're looking at housing and you're looking at moving into someplace long term, do you think that you'll need a proper HVAC system, or do you think that a ceiling fan will be enough to keep you cool?
Right.
Are you near a fire zone? Are you near a flooding zone? I actually, as well, made a conscious decision to rent because I'm not sure if I wanted to get into a 30-year financial agreement when I don't know. I mean, we kind of know what the climate's going to look like in a little bit, but Nashville, I think it was, just had a no, it was St. Louis,
Yeah.
just had a once in 200-year flooding event.
Wow.
And do you want to live near the banks of a river? If the river might flood,
Yeah.
so I think it's scary. I think it really is more about getting the checklist of what you think is safest and what you can afford and what will still be close to the support networks that you need. I don't have an answer per se.
I think
I
that
think
was a
it's gonna,
great answer.
yeah. Well, I think another one is, you also have to decide, when I say what you can afford, are you going to give up certain things in your life in order to
Right.
afford to live in a more climate stable area.
Right.
If you have a car, do you think that financially it'll be better off for you to ditch the car and live in a more transit oriented development? Can you find one that has below market rate subsidized units, and can you hop on that wait list? Um,
And
yeah,
are the services close enough for you to access without a vehicle of your own too?
exactly.
Yeah. Now, before we run out of time, I definitely wanted to ask you about advocacy. Obviously, the fight to deal with the climate change problem is, as you said, multifaceted, maybe multidimensional. But in terms of the next few minutes, what are two or three legislative or public policy things that you and your organization are keen towards happening at the national and regional levels to make a dent in the way we look specifically at the housing problem?
Yeah, so I'll say with our organization, as I mentioned, we're kind of in a transition phase.
Right.
Right now there's nothing concrete on the docket around housing. I will say a great place to be involved is this is what I care most about, I think, and a great place to be involved is transit-oriented development,
Mhm.
is really apartments and apartment development. We need them. We need them to keep rents down. We actually, something else that I forgot to mention is that we need them for a certain amount of housing redundancy because California, for example, sometimes loses 10,000 structures in a year to wildfires, and those people are going to have to go and move somewhere.
Right.
If you can build it in a place where it's low carbon impact and it's accessible, more power to you. And I think that that's a great way to get involved. I personally sat on the BART Community Advisory Group for when they were putting new housing at the Ashby and North Berkeley BART stations. And that was in a volunteer capacity. Something that people didn't think about in those conversations was how do we make sure that these are more accessible? Can we put additional criteria above what the city already requires for accessibility? The other side would simply to be involved in some sort of city level politics and try to draft up, say, as a member of the Disability Commission, a little bit of a change to a housing code so that it can have more universal accessibility and then say, hey, everybody, let's really, really, really focus this on transit oriented development. I think that a lot of housing work that people can do is good for climate, but just good for increasing the housing stock for people with disabilities in general, and increasing the housing stock while we're in a housing shortage, too. So,
So
yeah,
that's those are great ideas, and it talks to the power of local
yeah.
engagement and local activity. Do you see anything that is out there that, from a national perspective, you'd like to see happen in terms of
Um,
housing policy?
no, and I need to I need to
You
hop
you wanna
more
think
on
about that,
the
huh?
national housing conversation. Yeah, I'd love to hear more from you about what you think is valuable, really, for actually increasing accessible apartments more than single family homes, and the duplexes being really valuable. I loved that episode that you recently put on, or it
Um,
might have been not so recently. It might have been the first couple of seasons.
with podcasts, you never know what you're listening to. Sometimes
Yeah,
you don't know whether you've listened to something that was a year old or 6 months older. But no, but I think that the federal government does have a role to play, and HUD has a role
yeah,
to play in terms of they have all these tax credits, they have all these public policy produced initiatives to create housing. And some of the developers I've spoken with who are trying to build inclusive communities or trying to find housing solutions tap into some of those resources. And what I'm wondering is whether they have to jump through all these hoops. The feds say you want our money or you want our tax credit, you have to do this and this and this and this. I wonder whether those little requirements could be tweaked a little bit to be more to touch on making sure that we're thinking about environmental issues, climate change,
yeah.
as they put these policies into place. That's kind of where I think there's plenty of room for a discussion. So that's what I was kind of thinking about.
Yeah, and I think that uh in terms of the National Environmental Policy Act, and then here in California, something that causes people headaches sometimes is the California Environmental Quality Act. And those make it where you have to write a certain little environmental impact report when you're building new construction. And the way that we look at it, and the way that the government evaluates those, is what's the immediate environmental impact? What's the environmental impact of cutting down a couple of trees to put in a duplex or a whole apartment
Right.
complex, right? They don't look at or request what is the environmental impact of the alternative of doing
Right.
nothing so that you have more suburbs and exurbs and people commuting. Right. I'll leave it at that. But I think that we need to consider and figure out a way to incorporate into federal and local and state laws to say this project is better than the status quo or the alternative, even if there are, yes, a couple of trees chopped down in the process.
Right.
And I wish that legally we could insert a little bit more nuance
Right.
into the way that we evaluate projects.
You're not the only one. um, but this has been great, Alex. I really, really appreciate you coming on the show and talking about this, because I have a lot of really good conversations with people about specific projects around how we create or how we make housing accessible and safe. But to talk about it with an eye to climate change, I think is really great and refreshing. And I really appreciate your time today. Thank you for being a guest on my show.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for raising awareness about everything that you do. I've had a really good time.